Hi everyone, my name is Jeani Atlas. I'm a political science and law societies and justice major and the president of Pi Sigma Alpha. I have the honor of introducing our acclaimed speakers. Chris Adolph is an associate professor of political science, a core faculty member at the Center for Statistics and the Social Sciences, and an adjunct associate professor of statistics. His research specialties include comparative politics, political economy, data visualization, and political methodology. Professor Adolph earned the International Political Science Association's Charles H. Levine Prize for his book, Bankers, Bureaucrats, and Central Bank Politics, The Myth of Neutrality. Today, you will hear him speak about his work examining the politics of social distancing. Jake Grumbach is an assistant professor of political science. His research interests include American federalism, public policy, racial capitalism, and campaign finance. Professor Grumbach's dissertation, Polarized Federalism, Activists, Voters, and the Resurgence of State Policy in the U.S., won the E. Schattschneider Award for Best Dissertation in American Politics and the William Anderson Award for Best Dissertation in Federalism, Intergovernmental Relations, or State and Local Politics. He will be speaking about the electoral impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Michael Fong is the Senior Deputy Mayor for the City of Seattle. Currently, he is directing much of Seattle's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He has spent the last 19 years working for either the City of Seattle or King County. During this time, some of the positions in which he has served include the Chief Operating Officer for the King County Executive, Chief of Staff for the Mayor, and the Deputy Director of the Mayor's Office of Policy and Innovation. Perhaps most notably, he is a 1999 graduate of the University of Washington Department of Political Science. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the panel.
Welcome to our first and hopefully last virtual faculty panel. My name is McKenna and I'm Vice President of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Political Science Honor Society here at UW. Since late December 2019, COVID-19 has infected over 3.5 million people and killed at least 250,000 around the world. Nearly 40% of those infections and 33% of those deaths have occurred in the United States. Every state in the US has been affected socially and economically by this pandemic. The federal government has largely limited its role to offering public health guidance and recommendations rather than issuing mandates and offering substantial but limited financial assistance. For this reason, pandemic response has become largely a state and local issue. The social and economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic are vast and uncertain. Each of our panelists today will be focusing on a small part of this larger puzzle. Associate Professor Chris Adolph and his team have been tracking state social distancing policies and studying their epidemiological consequences. Seattle Senior Deputy Mayor Mike Fong has been leading much of the city's multifaceted response to the pandemic. Assistant Professor Jake Grumbach, a Federalist expert, has been thinking about federal and state roles in election administration and how the current pandemic may impact what happens in November of 2020. After the presentations, our department chair, John Wilkerson, will moderate a short question and answer session. We hope that you enjoy the panel and we wish you and your families good health.
So welcome and thanks for having me at this faculty forum on state politics and the coronavirus pandemic. I'll be talking about some joint research that I've done with faculty and graduate students in our department and at UW, which we call Pandemic Politics, State-Level Social Distancing Responses to COVID-19. But I'll also be putting that in a broader context of how the states and different countries are responding to COVID-19. So let's think back to before this crisis began, before 2020. How would you imagine the US responding to a pandemic on the scale of, say, the 1918 influenza? You might have imagined the CDC, the FDA, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the President all coordinating on a national response. You might even imagine a massive federal mobilization as if for a world war or some great crisis of historical importance. Instead, what we've all seen this is our daily life, is that the states are each individually leading in a piecemeal fashion, some quickly, some lagging behind. At the federal level, we mainly have a reality television show. And as a country, we have the highest number of confirmed cases and deaths in the world. The states have been left to develop their own policies. They've been told to source their own tests and even their own protective equipment during massive shortages. Many, including Washington State, have been very impressive in rising to this challenge. Others, not so impressive. The CDC, the FDA, and Health and Human Services, other federal agencies have been crippled by poor leadership. You can just look at the testimony of Rick Bright, the former head of BARDA, just yesterday, as a whistleblower, saying that the leadership has been discoordinated, that there is no coordinated response, and that we're in for a devastating winter unless something changes. What's happened, instead of federal coordination and leadership, is a patchwork of universities and foundations filling the void. We're all familiar with Johns Hopkins' efforts to collect data. We all rely on them. Locally, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation has played a critical role in producing forecasts that inform states, private organizations, the federal government, and so on. And the Gates Foundation here in Seattle has played a critical role in funding the response. So how did this happen? How did we end up in a situation where it was the 50 states running the show and the federal government missing in action? So I have some speculation to put the rest of this presentation into context. But I should warn people that the history of COVID-19 is still unfolding. We're still measuring what's happening. It's complex, and there are many causes of the events that we see around us, and there are many pieces. So please take any explanations that I offer as speculative, things to be treated with caution when we talk about these cross-national differences. So let me talk about two possibilities. One is an institutional explanation. The US really lacks coordinating national public health authority. There isn't a national public health agency. Instead, constitutionally and by tradition, the United States leaves public health to the states and localities. Compare this to the experience of the European Union. Now, almost a decade ago, I did a study with some colleagues at the University of Michigan, Adolph, and Fonseca. We looked at 28 European countries, basically every country in the European Union plus Switzerland. And we found that 25 of them coordinated their public health policies at a national level. Only 3 of them didn't. And the exceptions, looking back at this during the COVID epidemic, are really intriguing. So the exceptions are the United Kingdom, Spain, and Austria. Now, Austria is quite a small country, and they've had a relatively small epidemic, even per capita. They've had 70 deaths per million confirmed. And bear in mind, any confirmed death totals are provisional. There are missing deaths and so forth. But what we can say is that so far, the United Kingdom and Spain have had some of the worst epidemics per capita in the world. They're both around 500 plus deaths per million confirmed, and that compares to a European average of 213 deaths per million. The US is ahead of that US average, despite having an outbreak that started later. This outbreak started in China and Asia, then Europe was considered the epicenter by the World Health Organization. Now the US is doing particularly badly. But I think it's really intriguing that states which do not coordinate public health at the top level seem to be doing much worse in facing this epidemic. So there may be an institutional explanation for why the states ended up facing such a huge crisis in the United States and why we are in such a bad epidemic. But there also could be a purely political explanation, and this ties to much of what I'm going to talk about today. Could politics be a major cause of aggregate COVID-19 outcomes? The lack of truly comparable data makes it hard to say. We're still inadequate in our global understanding of where this disease is and who is dying and who has it. But if you look at the data we have so far, it's suspicious, it's conspicuous that a number of countries that prominently are run by populist right-wing executives of a kind we have not seen for generations have very high numbers of cases and deaths. And here I'm thinking of the United States and Brazil and the United Kingdom. It suggests that leaders who ignore science, movements that systematically distrust expertise, and political parties that blame social problems on other countries, on people who are different from them, that all of those instincts may be massively counterproductive when facing a threat that doesn't care about our petty social differences, a threat like a virus. What COVID-19, I think, reminds us is that governance is hard. It takes experience, knowledge, and skill. It's not something that we can do in a blasé or amateur or showman-like way. And so that sort of frames my discussion of what's happening within the states. But it's important to remember that this didn't have to be a story just about the states. And in the longer run, I'm going to suggest that it can't remain a story just about the states. So what I've said so far is more speculative. What I want to talk about now is the research that I and the rest of my team have been working on. And this is less speculative. We've gathered a lot of data and we think that we found some important relationships. So whether or not the states ended up in charge because of weak national institutions or poor national leadership or both, by March of this year, the states faced a crisis. And each of the 50 states had to rapidly decide on a coronavirus response, choosing from a menu of very unfamiliar and extreme social distancing policies. So these are not things that most state leaders had been thinking about very much, certainly not governors or mayors dwelling on these things and suddenly had to make very difficult choices. Some states acted quickly and broadly, like Washington State. Others waited a few days and then started to catch up. And still other states took very limited action relative to the more extreme measures taken by the most aggressive states. Why does a few days delay matter? Well, with the virus spreading exponentially, and there's no natural immunity, there's no vaccine, and at this point, it looks like the infection fatality rate may be almost as high as 1%, judging especially from antibody tests in New York, but all the available evidence we have suggests something in that range. It's really strongly suggests that every day mattered, that even a few days delay could be catastrophic for public health. So what our team, which it consists of John Wilkerson, Kenya Amano, Brie Bang Jensen, Nancy Fullman, and myself, what we wondered was what explained the adoption of social distancing by different states. But to explain that, we first had to measure it. What were the states doing and when did they do it? And what we realized is that when we started asking this question in the middle of March, no one had a good handle on exactly what the states were doing. And so we started collecting that data. So when we began coding states' adoption of social distancing measures, we had to identify measures. And the first that we identified is whether states recommended closing or restricting public gatherings. And so this graphic shows what we found, the dates on which different states issued a restriction on public gatherings of any size, and they gradually made those more restrictive. And virtually all states ended up doing this. In all, this is just one of 5 measures that we coded and began posting daily to a GitHub. The web address for that is covid19statepolicy.org. Anyone can look at it, and we continue to try to keep this data current. We're working on measuring adaptations and rollbacks in these policies now. This is a volunteer data collection effort, and it informs a number of forecasting models and tools. So this is being used by people at the Institute of Health Metrics, Imperial College London, a team at GitHub that's working with people at Microsoft to make these data and forecasts available to policymakers in a convenient way. So we find that a lot of people are using this data. I should say this is a volunteer effort and so far has not been funded by the university or by federal agencies. So it remains unclear how long we'll be able to keep this going, but we hope to continue to provide something of public use. So this graphic above and the presentation is really going to be focused on the early response. We're continuing to collect data, but the reason I want to talk about the early response is that at that point, states were definitely on their own. The federal government was largely inactive, not giving clear guidance, and states had to figure out this new policy. So it's essentially a natural experiment where we get to see how these policymakers respond to a tremendously important, but also very new policy problem. After implementing gathering restrictions, the next step, just a few days later in many states, was to close schools. And almost all states have done this. The only exceptions are places where schools essentially closed themselves before the states acted, or recommendations were sufficient. The 2 restrictions that we're talking about so far, school closures and gathering restrictions, have remained broadly in place. But if we look at other measures, like restrictions on the normal operation of in-service restaurants and bars, we see that it took a bit longer to implement these measures. And in some cases, we're now seeing these measures relaxed in certain states or in certain areas of certain states in different ways, with lots of complex adaptation to try to make the experience of eating at a restaurant safe. The most difficult and controversial step, and this is one that definitely not all states took, was closing non-essential businesses. Now, Most states closed some non-essential businesses, but comprehensive closures only happened in a bare majority of states. And there are some states that essentially did not close these businesses at all. So this is where we found the most variation, the most complexity. It's also where there's the most complexity in the evolution of these measures and their relaxation and adaptation that's going on right now. Just like non-essential business closures, we looked at stay-at-home orders. They were also not uniform, and some were advisory, many were mandatory. If you put all of these measures together and look at what happened over time, we find that many states followed a pattern of ramping up over the month of March. But some states never went beyond one, two, or three measures. Sorry, some states never went beyond 2 or 3 measures. Many did 4. Only about half did all 5 by early April. So there is, despite this general pattern of diffusion or ramping up, a diversity of approaches by the end of this period. And we asked then what explained this variation in timing, particularly in the critical early days when states had to puzzle this out without much guidance. Our early results from this project can be found in a paper that's at medRxiv, and the latest version of this paper is now under review. I can't share the latest version because of a journal embargo, but I will talk about some of the results here. And so what's going to follow are results from an event history statistical model that uses the most updated data. The basic story is the same as that medRxiv paper that I referred to. And so here is our most important result, which is that the key correlate of delays in state social distancing measures is the party of the governor. Republican governors delayed each measure on average by 2 days. Now, some less, some more, some never implemented those measures, but that's the average. And it's quite statistically significant. Is this a big delay? Well, with the virus spreading exponentially, in some cases, in some states doubling every 3 days in cases, and other states is taking as long as a week to double, a 2-day delay is potentially disastrous. We didn't have days to burn in deciding how to respond to this virus. There was a lot of debate at the time we were doing this research in March and in early April about what was causing these delays. And many people suggested that partisanship was an illusion, that it was really something else, like densely populated states feeling they had to act more quickly, states that were coastal that had connections to other countries, states that had more cases, and so forth. But what we find is controlling for everything anyone can think of, partisanship is always the strongest, most important factor. Population density seems to matter, but not as much. Learning from neighboring states or peers is not nearly as big a factor. And perhaps most strikingly, partisanship played a much larger role than the scale of the public health threat in each state. So if you look at the bottom entry on this chart, having more confirmed cases only sped up response by about 10 hours, not by the full 2 days that we see for the partisanship of the governor. We tried looking at this lots of different ways. We considered many different alternate explanations, including other political explanations, other public health explanations. No matter what we took into account, we found that the governor's party was always the most important factor in explaining delays in implementing policies, and in general had the same effect of a 2-day delay. So why does this matter? One response that people might make is that even without state guidance, lots of people all over the country eventually started distancing themselves and staying home. So was state response really important? There's actually, even if that's true, and to some extent that is true, there are at least 3 reasons to emphasize these partisan influences on governors and the delays they created. The first is that quick action by governors may have saved crucial days, and days matter with a fast-spreading disease. Coordinating everyone's response matters. Waiting for people to act on their own is not necessarily the best way to deal with this crisis. Second, it turns out there are significant partisan divides in who takes COVID-19 seriously. So research by political scientists Gadarian, Goodman, and Popinski suggests big differences across the parties in March and in April. So even as those differences have to some extent reduced, you have to wonder whether leadership from the president or governors would have mattered for getting us onto the same page. Had all governors acted in concert, certainly had the president really been consistent in talking about the threat that this virus creates and the need to rigorously socially distance to tamp down the virus, that could easily have sped things up and put us in a better position than we are today. But the most important reason that I think these results matter is that they show us how policymakers at this critical level of the states are coping with this complex new policy problem. And the challenge is that relaxing social distancing appears to be more complicated and difficult than imposing it. Figuring out the new normal, figuring out how to adapt these policies with COVID still present and a vaccine still an unknown period of time away, requires a great deal of expertise in governance. We're coding what states are doing right now and finding that they're fairly complex, fiddly policies. They're not just reversing what they did. They're implementing lots of new regulations to try to make things safe, trying to fine-tune partial easing of these policies. There's still strong suggestions in the data we're coding that the same partisan divides are appearing and how comprehensive and careful these new policies are, but we're still coding that data. We don't have results to share yet. A key area of differences across states that we're concerned with is the reopening in some states of high contact personal services and crowded indoor spaces. Some states also seem to be moving faster on business reopening. For example, things like nail salons or hair salons where risk of spread is considerably higher. And we might wonder whether this is being done basically to ease pressure on state spending. If you tell people they can go back to work and they refuse, then they're not eligible for unemployment. So this is a concern in states like Georgia. What this points to is the fact that increasingly the economic and public health responses to the virus are intertwined. And states are running out of resources to cope with either and may deal with that shortage in different ways. So I want to leave you with a few thoughts about the future of this crisis, because it's no longer just one crisis, it's many interlocking crises. With the federal government still largely AWOL, both on public health and economic policy, we need a response worthy of the Great Depression and World War II. That's the scale of problem we face. And so personally, I think that that response, to be successful in beating the virus and revitalizing the economy so that we're not stuck in a disastrous new world for an indefinite period, we need, I think, four things immediately. One is an Apollo-like program to test, trace, and isolate outbreaks. Another is an unlimited jobs guarantee to save the economy from a demand spiral. Not a patchwork program that is extended at the last minute by a few weeks here or there, but a guarantee backed by resources from the federal government that your job will be there or your benefits will be there and you'll be able to make it to the end of this crisis. A third thing that will become increasingly important is universal health insurance, universal health care access. With people losing their jobs at a frightening, unprecedented rate, the danger of tying insurance to jobs is never more clear. And so if people find that they can't go to the doctor, they can't get health care in a pandemic because they've lost their jobs, this reveals the incredible weakness of the way the United States distributes healthcare that's very different from other countries in the world. And the final thing we desperately need is massive financial support for hospitals, schools, and first responders. Hospitals have been hit harder than any other sector of our economy because of the loss of elective care. And so ironically, the very people who are trying to keep us healthy are being furloughed or losing their jobs or being closed. First responders are paid by states as they come under financial pressure. The people who have been trying to keep us safe are having their livelihood and their ability to keep us safe threatened. All of these, the reason I'm mentioning all of these programs, all these needs, is currently all of these essential things rest on the overwhelmed shoulders of the states. States really can't borrow. Only Vermont is allowed by its constitution to spend money that it doesn't have. They're not the federal government, they can't run large deficits. They're losing revenue very fast because their revenues depend on economic activity. Basically, states' efforts here can only survive with massive, immediate federal aid. And otherwise, they'll start making budget cuts that will worsen every problem that we're trying to solve. We'll lose all the things that are keeping the virus in check and our economy going. So you might ask, can't we just go back to work? That's Senator Mitch McConnell's answer. No more stimulus, no more state aid. Just let the states go back to work or go bankrupt. But it's very important to recognize that we have an economic crisis because we have a public health crisis. You could look at the research of Correa, Luck, and Werner on the 1918 flu, and what they show is that it's not the public health crisis that sinks the economy. Sorry, it's not the response to the public health crisis that sinks the economy. It's the public health crisis itself. So because people don't want to go out in a world where COVID-19 could be around the corner, the economy shuts down. If you take measures that cause the virus to be put in containment faster, you can get out of that trap faster. Put a different way, if COVID-19 runs unchecked, economic activity isn't going to recover because people will choose to stay at home, even without government mandates to stay at home. States can try to force the most vulnerable back to work by denying them unemployment benefits. They can say, risk your health and everyone else's or you'll starve. But that won't bring back leisure activities. It won't bring back restaurants or shopping or public events. We'll still have a massive recession because everyone who can stay home will stay home. But in addition, we'll have needless deaths of Americans of all kinds because the virus hits everyone. But we'll especially have deaths among the elderly, the immunosuppressed, the working class, and people of color who are disproportionately in those prior categories. So where are we headed politically in response to this new world? I'm going to offer two views. One is a negative one, and it's entirely possible. It could be that our partisan divide has never been sharper or more consequential since the Civil War, and now it's playing out in this new area of life or death, state by state. And thus the next months will be critical for the survival of our economy, but also for the hope of remaining one national community with a single shared fate, rather than 50 separate states each going their own way in responding to this virus. Another view, perhaps more hopeful, points out that very large majorities continue to think we should wait to go back to normal. Governors keeping social distancing measures in place, even in battleground states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, have seen huge popularity gains. The president, as well as governors who are trying to force people back to work, such as Brian Kemp in Georgia or Rick DeSantis in Florida, have seen no gains in popularity at all. So there's no rally around the flag effects in the aggregate population for people who have tried to just open everything back up. Yes, there are protests against social distancing, but they're really an astroturf fringe. They are not the mass movement that we might think just by looking at a video of some protesters. And so the question is there still hope for a united response to beat the virus? So I've taken this from XKCD, cartoonist Randall Munroe's series. He made this earlier this week. And he pointed out that it's really hard to get 100% support for anything in a poll. You can ask whether people like apple pie or kittens or Betty White, and you'll only get 86% of people saying they like Betty White and 81% liking apple pie. And yet, if you ask people what they think of the social distancing measures that we have taken, 86% say stay-at-home orders are responsible, not an overreaction. 85% oppose reopening schools. 91% oppose resuming big sporting events. 85% trust local health officials and healthcare workers. 93% are personally trying to maintain distance. And 81%, the same percent that like apple pie, think Americans should continue to social distance as long as is needed to stop the coronavirus, even if it means continued damage to the economy. This does not sound like a sharp divide down the middle of the country. Most of the public remains overwhelmingly supportive of social distancing precautions to beat the virus. The challenge now is to adapt these policies to cautiously and safely reopen parts of our economy and society, and that requires responsive and expert governance. Leaders of either party who meet this challenge, or meeting it now, are popular. But the national leadership of our country and several states' governors are missing in action in this new challenge. The recovery can't truly occur without coordinated, informed policy at the state and federal levels with massive federal fiscal support, because the states are going to run out of money and all will be for naught. And of course, once again, in a lifetime of most important elections, I think we once again have a new record, a new most important election of our lives this November. And my colleague, Jake Grumbach, will be talking a bit later about what impacts this has on elections. But I think I'll leave things there.
Professor Adolph, you mind? I had first of all, that was just an incredible presentation. I mean, your work certainly validates almost every observation I've had at the local level with the front row seat. But I did want to just follow up on some of your findings. I was curious if in the in the review of the data,
Mm-hmm.
state by state, beyond the partisan leadership being a driving factor, were there any other triggering events or emergence of some information, CDC guidance, something that would, because I also see, at least from where I was sitting, that at certain periods of time, there would be the emergence of a certain amount of herd mentality around,
Right.
really advancing social distancing measures. So curious if that is a factor in this.
This is a great question, and indeed is something that we went into this research really curious about. I think if, I hadn't polled John on this, but I think if you had asked us, early on, things we thought that had a likelihood of being strong predictors, it would be things in this vein. One thing that I think is interesting is Washington was at the forefront of this. So definitely for anyone carrying out a public response in Washington, that really had to be the case, right? Because you didn't necessarily have anyone else to imitate. And so you might think, well, each other state will proceed in a similar fashion. When they get news of cases or deaths, then they'll do what Washington did. And we were surprised that no matter how we cut it, the effect of in-state cases was relatively small. I mean, we looked at it every way we could, thinking maybe it's just, people are reacting in simplified ways. Maybe they're waiting for a certain number of cases. Maybe they're waiting for any cases. Maybe they're waiting for one death. Maybe they're waiting for a certain number of deaths. Well, the number of deaths didn't matter, and having any deaths didn't matter. It did matter having a certain amount of cases, right? As the cases built up, you're more likely to act. But it was definitely not the experience that everyone is sort of watching the numbers and acting in response to that. The other thing that you might think is that states would learn from peers, that react based on what their neighbors were doing. And that did matter, but again, not as much as partisanship. We wondered maybe states that have a lot of connections, if you receive a lot of incoming flights from Washington and California, maybe you'd think there's a problem coming and you should react. That did not matter. We really looked for everything we could think of, and no matter what we threw into that model, the effect of partisan governors was always the most important. It was always essentially the same. So we're not saying that those things didn't matter, that there wasn't learning going on, but that it was drowned out, in a sense, by political ramifications.
And yeah, Chris, absolutely amazing presentation, totally compelling. Such important work you guys are doing, both on the data collection and the sort of theoretical and assessment of sort of the quality of responses and things like that. So I was just struck by now on your response to that question of thinking about federalism, and traditionally, institutionally, one of the supposedly great things about federalism is that states can serve as laboratories of democracy, learn from good policy experiments that prove successful in other jurisdictions, and reject the ones that are unsuccessful. But as you're really showing quite compellingly, like partisanship just completely in the modern era drowns out that sort of learning effect.
I mean, another possibility is that the time frame, the speed at which adaptation here was needed makes those theories perhaps less relevant, right? We looked, there's research, Desmarais and colleagues have research on sort of peer learning effects that you learn from states that are similar to you. And we tested for those sorts of network effects as well and found nothing. And we did it in lots of different ways. But our thought on that is, if you have to react in days, it may be a very different kind of mechanism from the normal diffusion mechanisms where you learn from what the policy does, you look at policy outputs, you have lobbying groups and networks where you spread information about this and you get pushed to do what another state did. None of that's happening in a period of a week, or at least not in the same way. Well, and so it wasn't altogether shocking that we didn't find those results. It doesn't suggest to me that those things don't happen, but it suggests that this is a different kind of policymaking. It's a natural experiment where everyone has to act at once. And what do you do in those sorts of circumstances? And unfortunately for us, we can't say, well, that's just a really weird thing that's never going to happen again. It's happening again now, and it's going to keep happening because we're going to have to keep adapting quickly to this crisis.
Well, I'll make the stronger argument based on, you know, year by year state data, that there does appear to be a diminishing, the policy learning happens within partisan groups of states via the partisanship of these lobbying and expert organizations.
I would totally endorse that as a general read on the literature, not from my own research, but from people like you and Andy Karch and other people working in this area. I mean, I think that's been going on since the 90s. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. Mike, you want to
Sure.
kick it off? Great. Thank you.
Sounds good. And again, thank you for having me. And Chris's presentation was very fascinating. And I'm struck by your comment. This is a different kind of policy making. I can certainly vouch for the fact that this is something different. This has been nothing we quite ever experienced. And as I pull up the my PowerPoint here, again, I want to thank the department for hosting this and inviting me to be part of this quarterly panel. And admittedly, truth is that every day has been a learning experience in this crisis response. And you know, we are, even though the last 60, 75 days or so has felt like a sprint, I'm reminded that we're really much closer to the beginning of this event than the end of it. And so there's much more to learn and take away from this, and really do appreciate the work that the political science department is doing to sort of broaden the perspective and give me a chance to kind of take a step back too today from the day-to-day grind, and both share a little bit of what we've been doing and seeing, but at the same time reflect a little bit on what others are doing across the country. So this is very fascinating discussion. So with that, I have a couple of slides here to just share a little bit about the local perspective and response. And I think much of what you'll hear from me, I think will sound familiar to some of the decision-making considerations and factors that Chris talked about earlier. Let me make sure. There we go. So in the next couple of minutes, hopefully I can pull back the curtain a little bit and share a little bit of the decision-making process and considerations and some of the work that's been happening here at City Hall, but also in terms of our collaboration with county government and state government, which really speaks to some of the findings in the previous observations and research, which is that the alignment at the state and local level has been extremely critical in terms of our ability to respond efficiently and effectively. And I really believe that's been a key factor, but I'll get into that a little bit more. Like I said, I also want to spend some time on some lessons learned and observations to date. And then, you know, a little bit on sort of where we are now and some of the issues that we're grappling with and where we think the go forward looks like from here. But before getting into some of the details, I think it might be helpful to just take a step back on the context here, reinforcing just how complex the decision-making apparatus is with regard to the pandemic response. And when you have the traditional layers of government and the elected leadership from Governor Inslee to County Executive Constantine to Mayor Durkin, each of which have their own lanes and domains of authority that are surprisingly consistent with regard to what the state constitution and the county charter and the city charter, as far as reflecting what each of these executives has as insofar as a civil emergency authority. The extraordinary powers granted to each of them under this kind of crisis situation both means that they can execute swiftly, but at the same time, I think highlights how critical it is that there's alignment at each levels of the government. Inconsistency would create a fair amount of confusion, not just for the public, but also at the same time could run counter to each other as far as how to sort of address various policies around social distancing and non-pharmaceutical interventions when it comes to dealing with COVID-19. The other branch of the work that I think is worth highlighting is under pandemic response, there's a tremendous amount of authority bestowed upon the State Department of Public Health, and then even more so in some cases to the local public health agencies. It gets at a little bit what Chris was talking about in terms of our diffuse and non-centralized approach to some of the decision-making when it comes to pandemic response. The local public health authorities, and in particular the public health officer, has a tremendous amount of autonomy to be able to execute health orders in the spirit and in response to suppressing disease transmission. So in our case, Dr. Jeff Duchin has quite a bit of expansive powers when it comes to ordering certain actions that must be complied with by the public in order to meet public health interests. At the same time, the public health officer also has the ability to actually order individuals into quarantine and isolation to the extent that he or she deems necessary. So, and in some cases, the local health authority power actually exceeds that of the State Department of Health. And then the third sort of branch of operations that I wanted to just touch on is at every local and state and county level of government, there exists a emergency management infrastructure, incident command structure that is put in place for any kind of major disaster emergency response effort. And obviously at all levels of government, that apparatus has been initiated in order to provide the coordination and backbone support to the decision-making and guidance is coming from the other two branches of authority. And while this shows a somewhat, what appears to be a hierarchical framework, it really isn't, because for the very reason I talked about earlier, in that the mayor's domain, the county executive's domain, and the governor's domain are all different. And given their charter and constitutional authorities, they can execute directives within their jurisdictions, really in large part in isolation of the others. Now, fortunately, we have had good alignment and haven't run into too many of those issues, but you can imagine there could be quite an inconsistent response if of different persuasions if there isn't that alignment. I might also just add for the other panel members, as I go here, if there are any questions, I'm also happy to take them as we go too, because it's pretty dense content, but happy to just sort of kick some things around as we go. To that point, the governor brought in Vice Admiral Rocky Bono as someone to help coordinate a pandemic response to COVID-19 a couple months ago. Most specifically around the issues about hospital capacity, PPE, and other sort of necessary coordination to happen in order to ensure that the state is responding as effectively as possible due to this really dynamic situation. A few weeks into her tenure, we had a meeting with her and the county executive here at City Hall, and I was struck by a comment that she made, and this is can't remember her exact quote, so just paraphrasing here, but she mentioned that when she was in the military, they often ran simulations and tabletop exercises around pandemic response. But the actual playbook when it came to responding to the pandemic was actually fairly straightforward in terms of moving up or down, depending upon your perspective, on non-pharmaceutical interventions and social distancing, as well as the sort of epidemiology and metrics associated with tracking the pandemic itself. But she remarked that what was most complex and challenging in those tabletops was actually the multi-layers of jurisdictional authority, the different personalities involved in different levels of government, and also just who's responsible for what. And that, to me, has been one of the more interesting observations as we've gone here, is that the disparate elements as far as who is in charge of what elements of the response has been more complicated than anything, to be frank. I also think it was Admiral Bono's a friendly way of saying different politicians and egos also contribute to some of the challenging dynamics that could come into the interplay here, responding to such a complex situation. So along the same themes, just to sort of give some examples and illustrate some of the distinctions between public health guidance and their domain of authority relative to policymaking at the elected leadership level and legislative level, and then day-to-day operational decisions that we're making as part of the executive branch of government here at City Hall, but presumably also at other levels of government. But and these all have interplay with each other, but I think it really highlights the fact that the both vertical and lateral alignment around these decisions are critical to be effective. I mean, for the most early stages of the response, as was remarked about earlier, the pace for which decision-making was happening, where public health was reacting to epidemiological information and providing their best guidance as far as how to suppress disease transmission, it would then need time for policymakers to both bolster what the public health guidance was and solidify it from either a directive or legislative manner, but then to operationalize some of these guidelines would take time as well. And by the time we would develop the operational guidelines, new public health guidance would be coming up already. So it felt like the first days and weeks of the response, we were constantly under pressure to keep up with a dynamic situation. But at the same time, the playbook may be outlined as far as how you move up the chain of minimizing public gatherings, and then moving towards stay-at-home orders or other kinds, closing schools. But each of those strategies requires a whole host of policy and operational decision-making to be put in place. And at each step of the way, it felt like we were playing a catch-up. So we're in a little better place now, but it is something worth noting that is a tension there. At a high level, just wanted to provide a little insight in terms of how we've organized ourselves in city government and our emergency response. Every day, Mayor Durkin and I have a stand-up meeting with members of our cabinet. We have reorganized the way we are carrying out day-to-day operations by focusing on these four buckets or branches of work, and have divided our cabinet members and city officials into these key strategies. Public safety and public health, which is much has revolved around first responder efforts in the context of COVID, but also our link to public health is strong in the sense that we have had a long-standing partnership with Seattle and King County. But the truth is that public health ultimately is a county apparatus. The city of Seattle itself does not have core competency or subject matter expertise in public health response. But at the same time, we've asked our personnel to step into lines of business issues such as testing and contact tracing and other areas of public health's domain beyond their usual course of business. Community needs certainly has been a huge emphasis, as was talked about before, the economic fallout and the unemployment rates, and has just created the need for us to bolster social safety net in ways that we've never imagined. Again, entering new lines of business that are not traditional lines of business for the city, and also forcing us to think creatively in terms of how we use revenue resources to be able to do what we can to help people in need during this time. Obviously, homelessness and human services. Homelessness was a challenge that far exceeded the city's capability to handle on its own prior to COVID, and COVID only exacerbated that challenge and magnified the scale for which those experiencing homelessness presents in a pandemic situation. And that has been a high emphasis area for the work of the city. And then finally, of course, city operations, our ability to continue to execute is also impacted just as everyone else in the public and private sector as far as our workforce, our move to telecommuting and offsite working, and also looking at our own continuity operations in terms of paring down what are essential functions that the city must continue while we continue to move our way through COVID. This slide is something our Office of Emergency Management put together, which is just tracks the epidemiological curve in terms of new cases presenting themselves over the last couple of months, with an overlay of city and county actions, key actions that happened over that same time period. I know this is a little small for folks looking at home, but I think for just illustrative purposes, just wanted to show kind of where we have been in terms of the intensity of actions over the last 60 days or so. And also this is a good view, which is something that we've commented on a lot since the beginning about this notion of flattening the curve. And what you'll see is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we have certainly felt that the strategies that we have deployed have brought our numbers down. But even as such, the modelers and researchers and public health officials that we've been talking to is that where we're at right now is less of a complete flattening, but more of a leveling out. We're, in terms of, we've definitely seen a slowdown of the number of cases, but we probably aren't exactly where we need to be, which is what reinforces the mantra that at least the governor, county executive, and mayor went into at the front end of this crisis, which is that we would let the facts and science drive the decision making. And that was a very intentional decision that the three electeds made early on to ground ourselves in terms of how we would work together, in spite of the fact that inevitably policy and politics creeps into the conversation, but we really do want to anchor around what the data and what the science and what the facts are telling us. And that's held true thus far. So quick summary, early short-term priorities, again, just to recap, given our domain in the city of Seattle, first and foremost, executing emergency response operations, putting our apparatus in play, the challenges directly impacting our frontline workers, first responders, police and fire, personnel that work in homeless shelters, just trying to dial in exactly how they would carry out their work. Also, the modification of our basic city operations and what are essential functions, and then reorienting our day-to-day governance and decision-making around how we would respond to the emergent needs related to COVID. Second big piece of priorities, and we've talked a little bit about this, is showing up the safety net for community needs. We made a decision early on that we knew we would need to step into places and spaces that were not traditional lines of business. We've created food voucher programs and rental assistance, emergency childcare. We've creatively used sweetened beverage tax for food vouchers. We're using housing levy money for rental assistance. We're using education levy money for emergency childcare. We're using community development block grant money for small business grants. Everything we can to look under every seat cushion to deploy resources in a manner that may not be traditional or historical use of those resources. At the same time, we're confronted with what we are estimating at this point already at least a $200 million hole in our general fund resources. So the pressures are coming from both ends in terms of a loss of expected revenue from the downturn in the economy and economic activity. At the same time, community needs are growing substantially, and we need to try to meet those to the extent possible. And then finally, because of our role with regard to the healthcare system and the healthcare infrastructure is actually more so on the periphery, the work that we've been doing is to try to support King County public health as well as our healthcare system through things such as we created a PPE donation program. We did stand up our own mobile testing apparatus through the fire department. Again, not a typical line of business, but we have found ourselves now in the testing business. We are in joint decision-making with the county executive around social distancing measures and trying to align so that we're making decisions together. And then, of course, the united advocacy to the federal government for both FEMA resources as well as stimulus resources from the CARES Act and elsewhere. All right, so just to hit a couple of things, and I won't go through all of these. I've talked about some of these already in terms of early observations and lessons learned. We've talked about the speed and the pace of the decision making. I think both a sprint and a marathon, I think, is how I would describe this situation. The importance of alignment from the levels of government, that has been key. Grounding decisions in facts and science. I will comment that, and this is no surprise to anyone, but testing and PPE quickly turned into a Hunger Games kind of situation, and it kind of gets at the Professor Adolph's comments about the federal level support has been inconsistent and sporadic, and frankly the testing challenges have been enormous in terms of what we think is actually necessary to get to widespread broad-based testing relative to what we're actually able to do. And really both of these things have been supply chain issues. It's in the testing side even less so laboratory or personnel, but swab kits and testing kits have been a huge challenge, and frankly, a point of significant frustration for the mayor and the county executive and governor. Modeling has been extremely invaluable. And, when I asked the question about triggering events or information, I would say early on modeling, I think was a wake-up call for a lot of the decision makers in terms of early on the suggestions about the rate of transmission, the hidden amount of positive cases that was probably in our community due to a lack of testing, I think was extremely telling. That gave a lot of decision makers the information they needed and the confidence they needed to move quickly on what at that time was unclear if it was popular decision making or not around social distancing and other non-pharmaceutical intervention measures. But that modeling proved to be invaluable. At the same time, as time has gone on, that modeling has proved to be somewhat imprecise, given that such a dynamic situation, and I think partly the lack of testing and sort of some of the other factors creates some challenges in truly understanding what's happening in the community with regard to disease transmission. So it is still a work in progress. Talked about guidance and implementation needing to go hand in glove and the challenges that can present. I talked about the scale of this just being absolutely enormous in terms of exhausting our local resources and just needing more federal support in order to do what we need to do. And then, something we haven't talked too much about, but again, speaking to the complexities of the jurisdictional and governance, long-term care facilities and the adult family homes, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, they have a very complicated governance structure. Some fall under the state, some under private care. The ability to get in and do testing and do comprehensive coordination in that space has been extremely challenging. And what we're finding is, of course, older adults in long-term care facilities represent one of the most vulnerable populations in the entire pandemic response, and it continues to be a challenging space to work in. A quick glance at the current state of play. This is from earlier in the week in terms of the number of confirmed cases and deaths in the county, and then the average amount of tests that are conducted in the county and the number of average confirmed cases each day. That number is pretty important as a benchmark for us, the 85. Our experts tell us we really want that number down to closer to 30 or 40 to really feel completely comfortable about significantly easing up on social distancing measures and stay-at-home orders. And the reason for that is you want that number low enough to be able to execute contact tracing and containment in a way going forward so that you don't see a significant bounce back or clusters developing that you don't have sightline into down the road. And this is why the vastly disparate responses across the country raises questions about our ability to sustain disease suppression and not see some form of a bounce back in a couple of months, which is something that we are acutely concerned about. And then finally, the right now where we are is that while we continue to monitor and develop benchmarks and metrics around these epidemiology indicators, truth of the matter is that we are starting to look at easing some of the social distancing and stay at home and essential function restrictions in a frame of what we've referred to as reopening. And that is an extremely complex web to unwind. And as mentioned before, not as simple as just reverse engineering how we got here over the last 75 days, but coming out of it is far more complex, far more intricate in terms of how we set the new normal. And those conversations are both fascinating, but also extraordinarily difficult, because you almost have to go sector by sector, industry by industry, to think about the parameters and guidelines and specifications for how we can sort of execute safe reopening. We talked about the need for widespread community testing, just a marker there. The state has been doing roughly in the neighborhood of 4,000 or 5,000 tests a day. Our best guess in terms of meeting widespread community testing capacity is that we are able to conduct roughly 30,000 tests a day. So just to show you, we still have quite a ways to go to be able to meet a sort of recommended threshold for how much testing we want to be having conducted in the community. Tied to contact tracing, which is the ability to, when a confirmed positive case emerges, that we can quickly, within 24 hours, make contact with the individual and identify all the potential additional contacts that they have had that need to be engaged with, and then within 48 hours, making the contact with those other individuals to move towards containment or isolation. And that may take thousands of personnel that we currently don't have in play. Sustaining disease suppression, long-term recovery is sort of the next phase of our conversations, which is, again, both necessary but also an opportunity. We think of recovery here at the city as the possibility of how might longer-term impact of COVID give us the opportunity to reshape and reimagine what the city should look like. We're centering conversations around equity and a just community. At the same time, COVID has highlighted the fact that we interact with each other and do business differently. It also has highlighted the need to rethink urban planning and how we use our physical space and infrastructure. It raises some really interesting sort of longer term policy questions that the city wants to stay on the progressive front of policy on, and creates an opportunity for a dialogue, a whole community dialogue that we're hoping to start engaging in soon. And then, of course, operationalizing new normal and dealing with the realities of budget challenges that, again, as stated earlier, are not only significant, but will have long-term consequences that I think aren't even fully felt at this point on the economic side. I mean, all signs point to challenging times, potential recession, and unemployment, and we have not really even fully grasped the potential dynamics related to the financial challenges and loss of revenue that the city and state and region are going to need to deal with. So with that was a lot, but I'll conclude there and hope that this has provided a little bit of the local insight in terms of what we've been dealing with.
Wow, that's great, Mike. Challenging. Very challenging. I'm glad I don't have your job.
No, this has been unlike anything else we've had to deal with. So, you know, as far as real-time case study is concerned, I can imagine it's quite fascinating on the research side as well.
Yeah, it's a horrifying kind of fascinating, and it's in some ways, I think a lot of people have found that it's easier to, to throw yourself into studying it, so you feel like you might be able to inform people who are making these decisions, like you, Mike, that need as much support as we can give them, rather than staying on the sidelines. But it is still, not research as normal. I had a couple of things I did. They're not so much questions, but things I thought I'd just bring up, since they connected between the two presentations so far. And one thing I wanted to emphasize that may not have been clear from my presentation. When John and I in our research say that there are partisan distinctions in how states have addressed this, that doesn't mean that no one's paying attention to the science, certainly, right? Unfortunately, it seems like there's one party and some members of the other party that are primarily delegating to public health officials and scientists and experts and saying, tell us what the right things to do are to save lives and defeat the epidemic. And then many members of the other party are skeptical of the science. The president talks about things being a hoax, tries to play scientist or doctor on television. And so, I think it's totally consistent to say that places like Washington have said, we're going to be guided by the science and the data. And nothing in our presentation should be taken to undermine that. That is, in fact, sadly, one side of a partisan split. And so when you turn to things like what the right economic response or the right social policies are in the wake of COVID, then there may be more traditional partisan distinctions based on wanting to support different kinds of constituents or having different visions of a good society. But when it comes to fighting the virus, it's unfortunately the case that science itself is now, for many people, a partisan value. And there's a sense in which one party in our system has populist, anti-expert, anti-science values, or at least instincts in many cases. And so I just wanted to highlight that.
No, the only other thing I'll add on the truth is that as time goes by, the stakeholder, constituent, political pressures are becoming more acute as far as how to come out of the stay-at-home order, and it's starting to creep into the public discourse and the decision making, and it'll be really interesting to see sort of how long we can sustain that grounding, I guess. So fortunately, we have strong leadership at all levels, and we'll see. But nonetheless, those tensions are starting to emerge quite significantly. And also for us here in Washington State, tensions between the other side of the mountains and West Washington, right? So more to come. Very interesting.
I mean, this connects to some of this discussion about disease modeling and what's happening on the back end of this first wave. Previous research on the flu epidemic shows that if you do, crush that curve, then you get the best of both worlds. You get to revive your economy and you avoid mass death. One challenge that everyone seems to be facing with the coronavirus is getting from exponential growth to linear growth seems to be possible, but knocking that down to where the reproduction number is well below 1 has proven very difficult. And Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, was testifying about this earlier this week to Congress and saying, there's still outbreaks in places that are not shut down because they're essential and they involve a lot of contact. And then, of course, there are, just failures in, social distancing with a disease that has a long incubation period and spreads easily. But yeah, I mean, the longer we have only incomplete success, or the more places that don't comply, the more we all get thrown into a world where we have to make huge economic and health sacrifices. So these things are correlated, right? It's not that, there's a choice between them, but eventually we could be put into a situation where we have to take huge losses and we're just fighting over how much of what kind of loss. And what we need to do, obviously, is try to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and it does seem like, just the nature of the beast makes it really difficult to explain that from to the public, right? That, the harm is in a sense, right, hypothetical in the future, and it does depend on trust, right? So trust is key to this whole thing. And I guess for me, that's the part that I think is so disturbing about the politics, right? Is how the people that we really need to depend on, right, are the people that are being challenged, right? And
one more thing on that is just that it reminds me that in the early stages of this, the data always lags the reality of what's happening in the communities. So the governor, the county executive, the mayor standing up there articulating the need to move aggressively when the case numbers are very small, confirmed cases are not showing what we think is really happening, presented another layer of challenge, which is, I think, reinforces all the more important that the messaging was aligned between all the elected leadership, because otherwise, very hard to hold the public if not only because of the sheer disruption that the measures would have, but really the difficulty of even backing it up with what people are seeing or even with real numbers at that point. So again, very interesting, but fortunately, I think we still move pretty quickly in spite of those challenges.
I'm impressed at how quickly Washington, King County, and Seattle moved, and just still admire it. I wanted to put this in this little conversation in a slightly broader context. I know we want to get to Jake's presentation, so I won't take too long. But there's a great historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, who wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt, in which she pointed out how people who seek to attack science from a political angle, who seek to undermine scientific claims for political advantage, exploit the fact that scientists try to be very honest about the things they don't know, honest about their uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And if you are operating in bad faith, you can exploit that to try to create the impression in non-experts that scientists don't know what they're doing or making things up and so forth. And this was initially used in tobacco by tobacco companies to try to cast doubt on claims that smoking caused cancer. The very same people transferred that to carbon emissions and global warming. And we're seeing that same set of tools being deployed, unfortunately, in this case. Initially, like Michael said, you had not many confirmed cases because the data was still coming in, and you need to be able to rely on experts to say, this is what's going to happen based on the data we have so far, and it's almost impossible to stop this becoming bad, so we need to start reacting. That requires trust and not undermining scientists by creating, doubt out of well-meant scientific caution. And now we're seeing a new version of this, which is people saying, well, the models didn't come true, so therefore all of this is bunk. When I was in graduate school, one of my advisors pointed out that with disease modeling, something very unusual is true. You make forecasts so that you can then prevent the forecasts from ever happening. So you can never evaluate disease forecasts by whether or not they came true. The whole point is to say that's what we have to stop, right? So it makes it very hard to apply traditional judgment of, did you get that forecast right? 2 million people didn't die. COVID must not have been a problem. When in fact, that was why we acted so strongly. And so, not to drag this out any further, but it requires trust and it requires coordination and good faith. And people who try to undermine that, especially if they're in positions of authority, can do a great deal of damage in this sort of crisis.
One last insight to continue this point about coordination after great presentation, Michael, is thinking about, so under federalism, one challenge here is there's an asymmetry where the good places that do strong responses and trust the science, like Seattle's done a great job, Washington State, California to some extent, the Bay Area mayors, for example, have done a great job. But that actually cannot sort of overcome or outweigh the negative spillovers from places that do this sort of damage to trust in science and expertise, or just don't respond to the pandemic in a strong way. So great quote. Some internet meme was, essentially opening up some places. You can open up the peeing section in the swimming pool, but unfortunately, so it's really excellent what Seattle and King County and Washington State have done, and hopefully sort of provides a model for others. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mike, for a terrific presentation. And now we'll turn it over to Jake.
Just going to quickly close my window to avoid the blue angels or whatever is flying over. All right, a couple excellent presentations to follow. Let's share my screen. All right, so I'm going to be continuing, and I'm going to be talking specifically about the 2020 elections and the possibility of expanding vote by mail. During a pandemic, it seems pretty clear that to maintain social distancing, voting in person might be difficult with traditional long lines at polling places. One great solution to this is allowing vote by mail and all mail elections with potentially the possibility of voting in person the way Washington State currently does. And we assess vote by mail's effect in Colorado's statewide implementation of it, starting in 2013. And this is joint work with a few colleagues from around the country, Adam Bonica, Charlotte Hill, and Hakeem Jefferson. This is a very new project, and we put out a recent op-ed in the New York Times sort of making this case that vote by mail is a great solution to voting during pandemic times, and actually the evidence that we find suggests that we should probably expand it knock on wood, once we beat this pandemic. So in general, I'm going to talk about vote by mail and the Colorado model as potentially a sort of best of all worlds in terms of electoral policy, where vote by mail appears to strongly increase turnout overall in a country, the US, that does not have especially high voter turnout in general. It's especially effective at improving turnout among traditionally low propensity voters, such as young people and lower income people or people with lower levels of education. In addition, it's safe, and also we think it has a moment to get some bipartisan support. So in the mass public and to some extent among politicians, there's some decent bipartisan support for vote by mail, and it doesn't appear to have serious partisan effects on elections, giving recent evidence. And we think, therefore, there might be a window, despite the tremendous partisanship and polarization and sort of emerging anti-democratic principles within certain coalitions, that we may have the opportunity to expand vote by mail to additional states. California is currently moving the 2020 election to all mail voting, allowing some in-person voting, but we hope that this can go to purple states and red states as well that have traditionally not had these convenience voting reforms. So we focus on Colorado in part because, election administration experts, and election administration is done at the state level in the US since the Constitution. That's a constitutional power of the states. But election administration experts have pointed to Colorado's implementation of all mail voting as especially effective compared to other states, where California initially for many years has had vote by mail in precincts with under 250 registered voters that tend to be more rural, poor, often agricultural communities in the Central Valley, and did not put as much emphasis and resources in statewide implementation as did a state like Colorado. For this reason, we wanted to look at it as potentially the gold standard for implementing vote by mail in a rapid statewide manner that could potentially be replicated during this pandemic. So we use a source of data that's become increasingly popular in voter turnout studies, which is a national commercial data file. What this does is states, because they administer elections, they have state voter files that are public information that you can usually go to a state election commission and purchase, oftentimes on paper, the registrants in that state, and along with their addresses and sometimes some demographic details on them, like their age, and it has their voting records, whether they turned out to vote or not in recent elections. What these national commercial voter files do is merge all those state voter files and also merge in all their proprietary sort of advertising data from, smartphone behavior and all this sort of, scary data mining data that goes on these days. They merge it in and provide some sort of predictive modeling to try to capture other characteristics about these individuals. We don't tend to use those variables as much, but it's very interesting that they have, for example, the probability that somebody is, for example, a gun owner based on their magazine subscriptions and such. So it allows for a lot of new research into voter behavior that in recent years has really ramped up election and turnout related research. So we're going to do in studying voter turnout, right, Colorado or Washington or Oregon that have strong vote by mail policies are systematically different states than states in the US South or states in the Midwest that don't have strong mail voting policies. So in order to make an apples to apples comparison and ensure that we're not just picking up, you know, different characteristics of the people in these states or the politics of these states, we do a couple of different methods, but mainly we do what's called difference in differences with matching. So we take very demographically similar individuals with similar past voting records prior to 2010, match them from within Colorado to another individual outside Colorado, and then see whether the voting turnout rate of those individuals changes more in Colorado compared to the similar individuals outside of Colorado. And this massive national voter file allows us to do this very precisely, including for subgroups like, you know, young people or Latino voters or whatnot, even from a state like Colorado, which again is unique, not an especially high number of Coloradoans of color compared to other states, for example. We can still, we think, get a pretty precise estimate of subgroup effects here. And to do this apples to apples comparison, we specifically compare turnout records to people registered as of 2010. Although we do other methods to try to get the younger voters who may not have registered by 2010, you know, Gen Z, the Zoomers. But here we capture the greatest generation ever, millennials, up through the silent generation and their turnout rates.
Jake, can I ask you a quick question?
Please, absolutely.
So you mentioned race, right? And my recollection is that voter registration files don't actually have that. And so how did you get that?
Thanks, John. So some states like Florida do include self-reported race. And I actually believe in California, they have not race, but they do have ethnic background in some sort. So not only does the commercial voter file use those as variables, but it also, again, does this predictive modeling based on context, geographic context, name, and other, like, often internet browsing behavior and things like that. So that is essentially the one, that and occupational category are the ones that are predictively modeled through the voter file. So due to that predictive modeling within the voter file, you could consider those a little less certain estimates than our, for example, age or overall estimates, but we're pretty confident in the ability to predict someone's racial and ethnic background this way. And my own work on campaign finance separately uses this sort of technique to predictively estimate statistically people's racial and ethnic backgrounds among campaign donors to try to tease out the sort of racial demographics of money in politics in the US.
A number of southern states have race on registration. I think Louisiana does as well.
Louisiana, thanks. So overall, we were actually quite shocked. So we, this, in the election law research, quantitative research tradition, our difference in differences with matching is sort of a conservative test, typically, small c conservative test. It's not doing something comparing in the exact same election states that may have political differences and things like that. We still find what was, to us, a quite shocking effect of about 9 percentage points increase in overall turnout from Colorado's implementation of all-mail voting starting in 2013. You can see here, compared this estimate of probability of voting of 0.0873 is a lot larger than the increase in somebody's turnout when a Senate election happens. And these states that we compare have different timing of their Senate elections. And Senate elections often drive people out to vote compared to another midterm election with no, you know, large competitive federal offices. This is a tremendously large effect, we believe. So we wanted to dig in and make sure this is not some spurious thing that just happened by chance in Colorado, that it was actually due to the all-mail voting reform. And we begin to look into subgroups. So here we show that all-mail voting increases turnout most for young people. And this goes a bit against conventional wisdom. in that young people traditionally don't use snail mail that much, and they are less likely to have permanent residences, like older individuals who may have stayed in the same house and have a habit of getting their potentially no-fault absentee ballot or their absentee ballot for exceptions in some states. Young people are much more transient and mobile, and often buy into the hype of, the election week has a lot of media coverage, and rock the vote, get out the vote campaigns happen, and we wouldn't expect them to use vote by mail that much. But actually, contra that conventional wisdom, we see a massive, approximately 15 percentage point increase in turnout from all mail voting among my generation millennials, which goes down, but is still a quite large increase all the way up through the boomer and silent generation. Even this turnout increase of, around 4 percentage points in election law is actually quite substantial, where many get out the vote campaigns by organizations, large foundations that put in millions upon millions of dollars of getting out the vote, they consider a 1 percentage point increase to be a substantial one that they spend millions of dollars to accomplish. All mail voting, combined with the other sort of registration reforms that happened at the time in Colorado, appears to be an extremely effective way to increase turnout, especially among young people who turn out at extremely low rates. So for young people, their base rate of turnout is extremely low. This is taking a very, very low number. For example, even in the high turnout presidential elections, vote, in the 40 percentage point range compared to, up to 70 or percentage points or beyond for older people. That takes that up to at least modestly decent turnout rate for young people. In a country where leaders are overwhelmingly extremely old compared to similar wealthy countries around the world, where much social expenditure goes towards older individuals compared to younger individuals in the US, we think improving youth turnout is extremely crucial for democratic equality in the US. In terms of occupational class, we see here, again, an interesting pattern, and this relates to age as well, where the lowest increase in turnout, though still substantial, is among retired individuals who are often already voting by mail, absentee, or whatnot in these states. As you increase to professional occupations, management and finance, the highest increase in turnout we observe is among blue collar and technical workers. We find this again contra some conventional theories in election research, which suggest actually that it's, the super highly educated, the ones that have jobs that are more administrative and professional, they're the ones that like to get the mail ballot at home and study up and talk with their families, and that blue collar workers are not interested in it. They're interested in the hype of a polling place and just pulling the lever, but actually, we find that the increase in turnout is greatest among technical and blue collar workers. Similar dynamics by education, not the largest gaps, but you see less than high school diploma has the largest increase in turnout. Lowest relative increase in turnout is among individuals with a graduate degree who already vote at overwhelmingly high rates in American society. Continuing on. This is the biggest challenge to the conventional wisdom, we believe, is that vote by mail disproportionately increases turnout among voters of color, especially Black American voters, followed by Asian and Latino voters in the US, although still an extremely large and precisely estimated increase in turnout among white voters. But again, the conventional wisdom out of some early studies, for example, a study that I did out of California in 2017 that I now, looking back on, did not use as good methods as this, used precinct by precinct aggregate data with matching, less high quality method than this. And in California, where implementation was done essentially to say, okay, rural, low income agricultural communities, get yourselves on vote by mail if you opt into that. But we in the urban areas on the coast with a lot higher election administration resources will stay in person voting. And we concluded from that vote by mail was not great, and it was not great for Latino voters, for example. but actually that was a facet of the implementation of vote by mail in California, and the fact that it was not a statewide robust implementation of it that allowed for the Colorado model, or after the staggered county implementation in Washington, what we have in Washington now, which is absolutely stellar, where you get mailed, you get automatically registered at the DMV when you renew a driver's license, whatnot, car registration, you get mailed a mail ballot, you can still throw that mail ballot away, go vote at the polling place, or you can fill out your mail ballot, put it in the snail mail mailbox, you can put the mail ballot in a drop box out by Seattle Central College and City College and on campus at UW and downtown, and walking down the block, you can see people dropping their things in these drop boxes. It's a really robust method that allows people to vote as they wish. And that type of statewide implementation that says where everybody at all levels of government, referring back to Michael's presentation, where there are different levels of authority that must be in concert here, from the state to county election administrators, Colorado and more recently Washington have done so. And this evidence suggests that actually when it's implemented this way, again, lower propensity voters like Latino and Asian voters benefit tremendously, and Black voters who vote at high rates in the US also see a huge increase in turnout. Lastly, though, one might think, given these lower propensity voters, given young people, voters of color tend to lean Democratic, that you might see an overwhelmingly pro-democratic effect on elections. We actually find similar increase in turnouts based on the partisanship of people's registration. So registered Democrats and registered Republicans see a similar boost in their turnout from all mail voting, but the largest increase is among independents, registered independents, many of whom are young people who disproportionately register as independent. So that's one thing. However, there is some other research that uses aggregate election totals by party to assess the partisan effect of vote by mail. And that research by Andy Hall at Stanford and some co-authors also finds no partisan effect in aggregate election outcomes from vote by mail. So this, I'm of two minds of, with this fact. So first, I believe very strongly that the sort of partisan effects of an election law change should not be the criteria to judge the quality of that election law. Democracy and expanding democracy in the US to more voters, it should not matter who those voters go out to vote for if you allow people to participate. That is what small d democracy means. The Democratic Republic of the US deserves to have quality election law regardless of its effect on partisanship. And the perverse sort of normative thing here would be that if you have a system of very high voter suppression, removing some of those anti-democratic voting restrictions could have partisan effects. That does not mean that it's not the right thing to do to allow everybody to participate. So that's the first thing. I don't even like going down this road of reasoning. But given that this is, Republican elites, including President Trump, have spoken out against vote by mail as sort of a partisan ploy by Democrats, I think it is important to also note that the empirical evidence does not suggest a massive partisan effect in any way. Overall, making voting more convenient and easy is just absolutely crucial for American democracy. It's relatively hard to register and turn out to vote in the US, and that's one reason why voter turnout in the US is lower than many similar countries. Of course, than Australia, which has compulsory mandatory voting where you get a little tax hit if you don't vote, but even places just, with normal, robust election infrastructure just see much higher turnout rates, especially among young people. In the US, we can get to that if we expand policies like all mail voting with allowances of in-person voting. It's also really safe and effective. So rates of voter fraud are infinitesimally low in in-person voting, and yet they're the minimal evidence we have is that they're even lower in all mail voting. So threats of election fraud and things like that are not legitimate in this case. And we hope that this research helps show states that there are a few models out there of extremely successful all-mail voting programs that mail everybody a ballot in advance and then also allow for in-person voting. They're safe, effective, improve the quality of democracy. And we think in this political moment, there might be, especially given that Republican and Democratic voters in the mass public, all in the minimal polls that have been done, all overwhelmingly support mail voting and allowing mail voting. We think there is a political moment where even swing states and red states may be able to move on to all mail voting for 2020 and hopefully beyond, we argue. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Our chair, John Wilkerson, and my co-panelists, it's been really amazing to see all of your sort of expertise here.
Well, that's terrific, Jake. So pun intended, I was curious about the impact of all mail voting on, are there any gender differences?
We didn't look, but that's an excellent question. We should do it. Let me take that.
Good.
You're mute.
Yeah, I've got it now. Yeah. So this is really interesting, and I'm really happy to see it because I'd seen that earlier paper and was worried that California's weaker administration was making it a bad example to generalize from. Knowing Washington as a resident, I thought, Washington does this so well, it's got to have an effect. Our turnout rates got so high. So that's really neat to see. One thing that just looking at the graphs you have by age and by occupation that I couldn't help but notice is if you just look at turnout by age, it's almost the inverse of those pictures. And so one way that I could think about this, and what you're saying is absolutely, I trust is true and a reflection of the model that the biggest benefits are happening with people who are young and with people who are from non-white groups. But I really wonder if what's happening, another way to put it, is the more your category didn't vote before, the more you benefit. So it might even be the case that for non-voters of whatever type, there's relatively equal effects, which I think would support this story you're telling, right? That this is not about one group versus another. It's not about parties. It's not even about young versus old. It's just that, if everyone who's 70 years old already votes, you can't reduce their, you can't increase their turnout rate anymore. So the percentage improvement possible is low. But if you thought of it, out of the people who didn't vote in that group, what percentage now reliably vote? I bet those are really similar. And what's amazing is having a technology that is so unbiased because you administer it right, it just shows up in your home and it reduces all these costs to the same near zero cost for everyone.
So that's extremely well put, and I very much agree. The one exception is among Black voters, where they do actually have higher turnout often.
I wondered about that. Yeah, because I know that Black voters.
But the rest is so consistent with what you're saying, and I think that is the sort of the true model is that it's based on the propensity to vote overall. And the way I think of that is, okay, there are a few categories. Thinking through like non-compliance in experiments. This is very stupid for a public audience to go down this road, but there are people who would vote otherwise if the cost of voting were lower, and there are people who are, never voters, and there are people who are always voters, right? So what vote by mail, all mail voting, and these other reforms can do, including also, other work of mine is in same-day voter registration, which is also a crucial reform here, and now Washington has automatic and same-day registration reform. And just a note on that, like for young people, if you think about the solar eclipse that happened, a while back, and we had to get our eclipse glasses, and they said, get them in advance, they're gonna run out, and young people didn't, and then the week of are looking for eclipse glasses and can't get them. Same-day registration solves that problem as well. But the point here is that we think these groups that show the larger increases, like young people, it's that many of them are would-be voters if the cost were low enough, and that there's always, of all groups, there are going to be some never voters who, no matter how low the cost is, they're not going to vote, and there's going to be some always voters, no matter how high the cost or how difficult it is to take time off of work or how hard it is to wait in line at the polling place, will always vote. So it's really a function of who those people are. Really well put. I'm gonna use that framing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, please do. And it fits with other research I've seen, not on this aspect of voting, but just voting in general when you're trying to estimate the effects of different things on changes, because the baselines are so different, you need to adjust. I like the sort of causal inference language for doing that, but it just strikes me, that it's important for people who don't see that, who are judging this in terms of, am I a winner or a loser?
Right.
To say, it really is about fairness, and this is something that helps everyone equally. It's just some people already weren't voting, and some people already were voting. But
another analog of what you're saying about science becoming highly partisan and politicized, and unfortunately, the act of voting itself has become, unfortunately, more partisan than we'd like.
I mean, your comment about there being sort of emergent anti-democratic feeling is all too true, and people are now being much more explicit in saying they hope that certain groups won't vote, or they don't like elections, or and so forth, or just that the votes of certain people shouldn't count. When I completely agree. This should be guided by small d democratic values. It doesn't matter who you are. You should have the chance to vote, and we should make that as easy as possible. And we can. And with a pandemic, we'll benefit from public health. I mean, I think, one thing just to bring up, in Wisconsin, some people thought, hey, if we make it hard for people to vote, maybe we'll win the election. Well, they made it hard for people to vote. Some people got sick as a result, and they lost badly. Exactly. So, playing games with people's health isn't.
So that's the other thing. So, we often think just higher turnout in general always benefits Democrats. On average, that's true in most jurisdictions, but that was a case where that turnout rate in Wisconsin during that primary and Wisconsin Supreme Court election was like 15%. It was extremely low. Milwaukee had like 4 polling places open. Mail ballots didn't really go out. You also saw, that was mostly intentional in Wisconsin, versus there are other problems in Baltimore, problems mailing out the ballots. There are other challenges here that really require strong election administration, and also, unfortunately, national, state, and local experts and elites putting forward the same case that, okay, we're going to count the ballots on this date. We're going to have a coordinated procedure that we can all trust in the outcome. And the real danger is that that vote by mail, the true trade-off here that I think we need to be conscious of is, if vote by mail does change the way votes are counted or tallied in time early on, that this could allow anti-democratic forces to sow distrust in the results of the election. And Rick Hasten, the law professor at Irvine, has a book that's just coming out called Election Meltdown, which is really about this issue. So the states that have already implemented vote by mail have done it so excellently. So really taking a page from there, but ensuring that there's coordination once the ballots come in.
I think to tie this to our discussion of the pandemic, I think we take for granted some regularities in our political and social world, that this pandemic is changing, right? It's not that they weren't true, it's that they could change, right? So in voter turnout, one of the standard regularities is that elderly people vote at higher rates. And at the very highest ages, that drops off just because it does get very difficult for many people to vote because of health and age. But this has been a truism forever, that as people age, they're more likely to vote. But if you have an epidemic that has much higher fatality rates for the elderly, you could flip that around. And that may be what Wisconsin is saying, is that although they haven't needed it before, the people who need vote by mail now are the elderly. And the fact that it has the same effect on every age, potentially, given that you were not going to vote without it, that actually could be the killer application for vote by mail, right? That in the past, this helped the elderly vote a little bit more, but they were already voting. Now that they're not going to go out and vote for health reasons, this is critical to getting them to vote. And if you want to build a coalition around this, that Wisconsin experience and that's
brilliant.
Really critical.
That's an optimistic hope. And I think the polling results you showed in that XKCD comic, where there is just at a certain level reality happens and the rubber meets the road of that individuals, including in states where elites are very, not very enthusiastic about, preventative and protective measures against the, pandemic, that still the mass publics, the older mass publics, may want mail ballots.
Yeah. And just to return this to the discussion we had, with Michael, the issue of stakeholders, Michael, you brought up stakeholders putting increasing pressure, and that's to be expected. But some of that is stuff that governments can't fix, right? Let's say that you're a restaurateur and you want to be back in business. We can reopen restaurants, but that doesn't mean that people will show up, right? And so you could have a situation where business elites or just entrepreneurs, people who are putting pressure on their local government, state governments to relax lots of restrictions, find that the impact is we get sicker, no one wants to come to the restaurant, I go out of business anyway, and after several months I've gained nothing, but I felt like I was doing something. If instead we coordinated and tried to do our best to get through this together, there actually might be a normal on the other side in which a restaurant can survive. Restaurants can't survive indefinitely serving 25% of their capacity, right? Being desperate to get back to that is just being desperate to die slowly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wanted to, this is fascinating information, Jake. I wanted to follow up on one other piece just to see if we can tease out a little more detail. I'm curious if, as vote by mail gets implemented, there have been all these additional components with the intentionality around creating ease for for the voting itself, whether it's translated materials, the boxes around town that you were talking about, postage, free postage for the ballots. Do we have a sense of the marginal impact of those measures relative to the baseline impact of the mailing apparatus in general? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. So this, in election policy research like this, that is so key, and it's only emerging as a topic. So before we, including myself, unfortunately threw all sort of election reform policies into large buckets. You have, ease of registration reform here, you have some sort of, no fault absentee here, which can really vary in how to sign up, how easy it is to sign up for absentee voting, these sorts of things. Getting this sort of granularity where we're comparing, so the Washington and the Colorado models are very similar in this way. But the California comparison, I think, does show the difference when you implement it differently. The free postage, though, I think is crucial, and we don't observe many systems without free postage. But recently, the USPS, a number of weeks ago, announced that it would mail all no postage mail ballots, regardless of what state laws provide for. That was a really hopeful sign. The Postmaster General recently switched, and it's unclear whether that will happen, but we just haven't observed in the US enough variation on providing free postage or not to get a confident estimate of that's effect. But I would say that the clear things we can see in the granularity of this policy, allowing in-person voting for people who want it, plus drop boxes, plus mailing everybody a mail ballot is the gold standard, period.
Great. Very interesting.
All right. Wow, fantastic. And I love the interchange. We've never done that before. So I think that was terrific and fun and highly informative. We're almost out of time, and I think I'm trying to think about what our audience might be interested in. And I think the big question they're interested in is what's going to happen in November. So none of you are election experts per se, but I am curious about, this is not your normal election coming up, and there are all sorts of variables in the air, right, where we can't predict what's going to happen. But, for example, what seems to be a movement by Republicans, right, to say, forget about the damn virus, let's put people back to work, right? How are these things going to impact, what happens in November? I'm curious to hear what each of you thinks about that.
So I'll just say on that, I think that one thing that's perhaps easy to forget is when we say that it's a long time to November, we have to think about the things that are going to happen between now and then that aren't under necessarily our control. And one of them is that the economy is likely to get a lot worse, right? I mean, we're not doing enough at a federal level to protect state budgets, most of all, but a whole list of things that are already essentially in the can, right? When you look at the Great Depression or other major downturns, you have cycles whereby people's reduction in income leads to a reduction in consumption, leads to declining economic activity. And to fight that, you would need massive stimulus. The challenge here is that a lot of the stimulus you could give people is like pushing on a string. You can give them money, but if they're not going out and doing things, there are huge sectors of the economy that are just vanishing. When we look at past recessions, even the Great Recession, we didn't have huge sectors of the economy vanishing. And so the attitude that, you know, this will blow over or might blow over is one that I think some Republicans, particularly in Trump's orbit and Trump himself, would like to cultivate, because it's the only life raft they can see for dealing with a campaign season without having Hoover-like economic conditions wrapped around them. And I just don't see any way of avoiding that. People might look at the stock market and say, well, it's bobbing along, but that reflects assumptions about how large companies are going to get bailed out and pick up the pieces, not about what's going to happen to voters or households. And so I feel like if we look back at 2008, we could have had this conversation in the spring saying, yeah, maybe this will be a close fight between Obama and McCain. And by the time we got to September, it was like, wow, the economy is in really bad shape. The McCain campaign will have to pull a real rabbit out of a hat, and they're only this many points ahead, but maybe he could catch up. It was a very different world. This is going to be, I think, much more painful than the 2008 recession. And I think the headwinds of that will make winning an election, especially when the story of poor response early on is so clear, very, very difficult.
So Chris made the excellent sort of economic fundamentals argument here in a sophisticated way for the 2020 pandemic era. However, just the pessimistic take, which, there's great uncertainty. I'm not, don't take this to the bank necessarily, but the evidence is pretty clear. Even since 2008, the rapid polarization and hyperpartisanship is such that economic accountability has diminished as an electoral mechanism tremendously, even since 2008, where you saw the Republican Party's approval rating in the management of the economy tank in 2008. Whereas now so Chris made the point that Trump and many of these governors that promoted sort of, open up economy stuff have not seen the gains in sort of crisis management approval that other executives had. And that's very true. At the same time, I've been surprised at how minimal that gap is, and that some of these executives, including Trump, have not seen a dip in approval in ways we would have expected. And I unfortunately think this is going to be extremely competitive, is my guess, going forward. There's a number of things going on in terms of the ability of the Democratic Party to organize and get out the vote on the ground in a time when you can't be in person as much, and the presumptive Democratic nominee attempting Zoom outreach and stuff is a different model than we've seen for earlier sort of enthusiasm in terms of getting out the vote. And then just overall, you see just how disconnect, we are truly in an era of culture war, and now things like PPE and the use of masks and things are emerging as cultural cleavages, and it's actually a quite frightening moment, although countered by the positive polls showing social solidarity around social distancing and things that is really encouraging. So difficult to know. There's some selection bias in the media coverage of resistant groups that are appear to have their approval of those in power has nothing to do with any sort of social or economic outcomes of any type, and are purely cultural, expressive, and resentment based. That may be a small group, but remains to be seen. I think, and then in addition, unfortunately, we just have to bring up, the pandemic may provide more cover for potential malfeasance and mass voter fraud. And we saw some really troubling statements from, for example, Devin Nunes recently on using electoral administration in a hyper-partisan way. We've had a history, including of voter registration roll purges in the 2000 election and beyond. There are many, many things when the 2016 election comes down to a few thousand votes in a few Midwestern states, for example. The ability to do one of many, many mechanisms to change that outcome expands as the margins get so narrow. And in the Electoral College model concentrated in specific states?
Well, I will show partisan stripes here for a moment, probably, and remain optimistic that one, to the extent that there has been building motivation and enthusiasm in the enthusiasm gap, I still believe that the motivation and the 4 years for Democrats has been such that I still think that is strong and will only persist as a result of the frustration with the national pandemic response. That coupled with unless something dramatically changes, I remain convinced there's going to be a bounce back effect of cases of COVID. And given the timing of the election of the fall, it seems like we could find ourselves nationally right back where we were in mid-March, which will only, there's nothing, at least our political estimation has been, there would be nothing more demoralizing than to have shut down the economy, fired it back up, and then having to shut it back down again. That has been an organizing principle for us in our go slow strategy. And if our presumption is correct, then it will prove to be wiser to move cautiously now than to find ourselves in a situation where we're right back where we started. And if we thought that was devastating, or that things are devastating now, that would be even more devastating down the road. So those conditions seem to potentially yield some ripe turf for the Democrats, but we'll see. This is also as has been the pandemic, this has been an unprecedented administration, a political environment that is largely unpredictable. So we'll see.
Well, terrific. Thanks for taking that one on. I want to thank all of you for participating. I've really enjoyed this. And so Chris, Mike, and Jake, stay safe. And yeah.
Same to you guys. Nice to see you guys.
Bye.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks a lot.
Be safe.
Bye.